Welcome to the things that bother me. This channel exists because too many things that matter get dismissed, minimized, or rewritten once the damage is already done. Today's topic is one of those things. It's uncomfortable, it's personal, and it's long overdue. This video is about the baby boomer generation, not the myths they tell about themselves, but the outcomes they left behind. The housing that never transferred, the security that stopped with them, the families that were told to figure it out while watching comfort be protected at all costs. This isn't nostalgia, this isn't generational warfare, and this isn't about hating individuals. It's about patterns, choices, and consequences. These are not exaggerations. These are words that were said. These are conditions that exist. And this is what happens when a generation takes everything and calls the fallout someone else's problem. Let's begin. How baby boomer parenting failed their children. The story they still refuse to hear. There is a story baby boomers tell about themselves. It casts them as rebels who broke free, built prosperity, and handed the world something better. It is a comforting myth. It is also deeply incomplete. For millions of their children, the lived reality was neglect masked as independence, cruelty excused as tough love, and abandonment reframed as personal responsibility. The damage did not occur in one dramatic moment. It accumulated quietly, relentlessly, from infancy through adulthood, until entire generations were left emotionally hollowed out, economically exposed, and told the fallout was their own fault. This is not a condemnation of every individual boomer. It is an examination of dominant patterns, cultural norms, parenting philosophies, and moral frameworks that were widespread, socially reinforced, and rarely questioned. Patterns matter, systems matter, outcomes matter, and the outcomes are unmistakable. The generation that broke the chain. Every generation inherits two things, what came before and a responsibility to pass something forward. Baby boomers inherited unprecedented stability, cheap housing, expanding wages, strong public investment, and parents who believed their children's survival mattered more than personal comfort. They broke that chain. This is not a story about mistakes or ignorance. It is a story about choices, made repeatedly over decades with full visibility of the consequences. Choices to prioritize self, lifestyle, and ideology over family continuity. Choices to redefine neglect as independence and abandonment as character building. Choices to hoard security while their children and grandchildren absorbed risk. Boomers were not asked to be perfect parents. They were asked to be present, fair, and forward-looking. Too many refused all three. What follows is not generational whining. It is a record of outcomes, emotional damage, forced poverty, homelessness, hunger, estrangement, and a final act of disinheritance that ensures nothing is repaired. This is how a generation with everything ensured the next generations had nothing. The generation that took everything and left nothing. A total indictment of baby boomer parenting and its aftermath. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not a generational misunderstanding. This is not a clash of values. This is not younger people failing to appreciate what they were given. This is a record of extraction. Baby boomers inherited the most favorable conditions in modern history and converted them into personal comfort while systematically refusing responsibility for the generations that followed. As parents, they did not merely fail. They opted out emotionally, materially, and morally while demanding lifelong credit for having existed. They took stability and called it merit. They took help and called it independence. They took from their children and called it discipline. And now, at the end of their dominance, they are leaving behind trauma, poverty, and a scorched generational landscape, while insisting they did nothing wrong. This report rejects that lie. Infancy, neglect as philosophy. Boomer parenting began with emotional deprivation. Infants were treated as problems to be managed, not humans to be bonded with. Distress was ignored. Crying was punished through abandonment. Physical affection was rationed. The child's emotional reality was dismissed before it could form. This was not ignorance. It was ideology. The result, attachment disorders normalized, emotional suppression taught before language. a lifelong association between need and shame. Boomers raised children who learned early that asking for comfort was dangerous. Childhood, control without care. Boomers demanded obedience without offering guidance. Children were expected to self-regulate adult-level stress, perform academically and socially without support, accept punishment without explanation, internalize blame for failures they were never taught to prevent. Supervision was minimal, empathy was absent, authority was absolute. Children were not raised, they were contained. Adolescence, authoritarianism or abandonment. Boomer parents either clamped down or disappeared, one path enforced. Total control, emotional invalidation, moral absolutism. The other offered no mentorship, no protection, no preparation for adulthood. Both paths produced the same outcome. Adolescents forced to mature without adults, then blamed for the scars that followed. Age 18, the moment of abandonment. Boomers normalized a belief that should be remembered as one of the most destructive in family history. You are 18, I owe you nothing. This was not independence, it was expulsion. Children were forced out without financial footing, cut off emotionally and materially, shamed for needing time to stabilize. Boomers who were supported by their own parents into adulthood denied that same support, despite far worse economic conditions for their children. This was not fairness. It was moral cowardice, forced poverty, homelessness and hunger by choice. Millions of adult children and grandchildren of boomers have experienced homelessness, housing instability, chronic hunger, not because help was impossible, but because it was withheld. Boomers with paid-off homes, spare bedrooms, substantial savings, watched their families sleep in cars, rotate through shelters, skip meals, raise children in survival mode and called it a lesson. This is not tough love. It is deliberate cruelty. Contempt for struggle. When their children struggled, boomers did not adjust. They accused. They ignored wage collapse, housing inflation, student debt, medical bankruptcy. Instead, they blamed character. Struggle was reframed as laziness. Need was reframed as entitlement. Reality was dismissed as excuse. This is how a generation absolved itself while its descendants drowned. No change, no growth, no reckoning. Boomers did not soften with age. They hardened. They did not reflect. They doubled down. Estrangement increased, not because children were ungrateful, but because boomers refused accountability. Apologies were rare. Acknowledgement was non-existent. Blame was constant. They demanded loyalty without repair. Forced poverty, homelessness, and hunger as a moral lesson. One of the most damning outcomes of baby boomer parenting is not emotional. It is material. Across the United States, millions of adult children and grandchildren of boomers have experienced homelessness, housing instability, and food insecurity not because help was impossible, but because it was withheld on principle. This is not accidental hardship. It is enforced scarcity. When help was available and deliberately denied in countless families, boomers owned homes outright or with minimal mortgages, held substantial retirement accounts, pensions, or property equity, enjoyed Social Security, Medicare, and tax structures unavailable to younger generations. Yet when their children or grandchildren faced job loss, medical crises, divorce or domestic violence, economic downturns, student debt collapse, rent spikes far outpacing wages, the response was often cold, ideological refusal. I'm not bailing you out. I worked for my money. You need to learn the hard way. I'm not sacrificing my lifestyle. What followed was predictable and devastating. Be homelessness as punishment, not failure. Adult children were sleeping in cars while parents had spare bedrooms, couch surfing with children while grandparents traveled or downsized, living in shelters while boomers protected inheritance for people not yet born or charities they would never meet. Grandchildren were experiencing housing insecurity in early childhood, attending school hungry or exhausted, absorbing trauma that permanently alters brain development. This was not necessity. This was choice. Boomers framed homelessness as a lesson, believing suffering builds character. In reality, it destroys stability, health, and long-term earning capacity, locking families into cycles of poverty that only began because support was denied at the most critical moment. See food insecurity while wealth sat idle. Equally common was hunger. Boomers who ate out frequently, traveled regularly, upgraded homes, vehicles, and hobbies refused basic assistance such as grocery help, temporary support during unemployment, child food costs. Children and grandchildren skipped meals, relied on food banks while relatives had full pantries, normalized hunger as part of childhood, all while being told, "You should have planned better." Planning does not overcome systemic wage collapse, medical debt, or predatory housing markets. But greed does not care about context. The ideology behind the cruelty. This behavior did not happen in a vacuum. It was driven by a boomer-specific moral framework. Wealth equals virtue. Struggle equals moral failure. Help equals weakness. Family obligation ends at 18. Under this belief system, keeping money mattered more than protecting bloodline. Financial hoarding was reframed as wisdom. Abandonment was rebranded as independence. This is how a generation convinced itself that preserving retirement accounts was more important than preventing grandchildren from going hungry. The long-term cost they refused to acknowledge. The damage did not end when the crisis passed. Homelessness and hunger resulted in lifelong health complications, PTSD and chronic anxiety, educational disruption, reduced lifetime earnings, fractured family bonds that never healed. Boomers often ask why they are estranged. This is why you do not recover trust after someone watches your child starve and calls it a lesson. The unspoken truth. If boomers had behaved this way towards strangers, it would be called cruelty. They did it to family and called it character building. History will not be kind to that choice. No redemption arc. How boomers are ensuring nothing is handed down. If there was ever a chance for course correction, it was inheritance. It was the moment when baby boomers could have acknowledged imbalance, repaired damage, and stabilized the generations that followed. They largely chose not to. Instead of change, there has been doubling down. The myth of the great wealth transfer. Public discourse often claims a massive transfer of boomer wealth is coming. In reality, for many families, it will never arrive. What is actually happening? Assets are being liquidated, not preserved. Equity is being extracted, not shared. Savings are being consumed, not safeguarded. For a significant portion of boomers, the guiding principle is simple. I earned it, I'm spending it. Not we built this. Not this should stabilize my family. But I'm entitled to use every last dollar, spending patterns that leave nothing behind. Boomer wealth is increasingly diverted into three primary sinks. 1. Lifestyle consumption, constant travel. 2. Homes, recreational vehicles, luxury experiences framed as finally enjoying life. This is often done while adult children struggle with rent or mortgages. Grandchildren grow up without financial safety nets. Families remain one crisis away from collapse. 2. End-of-life medical extraction, long-term care facilities, assisted living corporations, privatized healthcare systems. Medical costs do not preserve wealth. They transfer it upward into corporate hands. Boomers are not protecting assets for heirs. They are funneling them into institutional profit streams. 3. Charitable giving that bypasses family. Many boomers prefer donating to universities, religious institutions, foundations, abstract causes, often while refusing direct help to their own bloodline. Charity becomes moral cover for neglect. Intentional disinheritance as a moral statement. This is not just structural, it is ideological. Boomers openly state, "My kids don't deserve it. I don't want to reward failure. They didn't live the life I wanted." Disinheritance is used as a final act of control, a punishment for independence, boundaries, or estrangement, a way to avoid confronting parental failure. Even when relationships are strained because of earlier neglect, boomers frame withholding inheritance as justice, not consequence. The end result: wealth flows upward, not forward. When boomers die, much of what they accumulated will not go to Gen X, Millennials, or Gen Z. It will go to healthcare conglomerates, financial institutions, investment firms, real estate corporations. The already wealthy elite. This completes the cycle. Boomers benefited from generational investment, refused to reinvest in their descendants. Insured wealth exited the family line entirely. They did not protect wealth. They returned it to the top, the generational aftermath. The consequences are severe and long-lasting. No inherited homes, no startup capital, no debt relief, no safety net, no margin for error. Gen X ages without parental support. Millennials raise children without backup. Gen Z enters adulthood with nothing but instability. This is how generational collapse happens, not through laziness, but through deliberate severance. The uncomfortable truth. Boomers accuse younger generations of entitlement. Yet entitlement is believing you owe nothing to those who come after you. You deserve everything built before you. And the damage you leave behind is not your problem. History does not measure generations by how comfortably they lived. It measures them by what they left behind. On that metric, many boomers are failing by choice. How history will remember the baby boomer generation, whether they accept it or not. Generations do not get to vote on how they are remembered. Memory is not determined by self-image, nostalgia, or the stories people tell themselves in retirement. It is determined by outcomes that persist after they are gone. On that standard, the baby boomer generation will not be remembered as visionary, rebellious, or transformational. It will be remembered as extractive, self-centered, and historically irresponsible. Boomers will be recorded as the generation that inherited the strongest middle class in modern history, benefited from massive public investment, entered adulthood during economic expansion, accumulated unprecedented private wealth, and then refused to transmit any of it forward. Not builders, consumers. History will not classify boomers as builders. Builders leave structures that outlast them. Institutions, safety nets, stable families, and opportunity. Boomers dismantled or privatized nearly all of these and replaced them with consumption. They will be remembered as the generation that monetized everything, turned public goods into private assets, treated housing as speculation, not shelter, viewed family as optional and disposable. They did not preserve, they used up. The generation that broke the family contract. Across civilizations, one principle has been consistent. Parents stabilize children so society can endure. Boomers rejected this. They normalized emotional abandonment, financial severance at adulthood, withholding help as moral superiority, estrangement as the child's fault. Future historians will not call this independence. They will call it familial collapse caused by ideology, moral grandstanding without moral cost. Boomers will also be remembered for hypocrisy. They preached responsibility, work ethic, family values, while refusing responsibility for downstream harm, hoarding advantages they did not earn alone, abandoning family obligations when inconvenient. They demanded sacrifice from younger generations while exempting themselves entirely. The generation that confused luck for virtue. Perhaps their greatest failure was intellectual. Boomers mistook timing for talent and fortune for merit. They assumed the world that lifted them would exist forever and blamed their children when it did not. History will not share that confusion. It will note that boomers climbed ladders they later pulled up, benefited from systems they dismantled, required help they later denied. This is not strength. It is short-sightedness on a civilizational scale, the final verdict. When the cultural dust settles, baby boomers will not be remembered fondly. They will be remembered as the generation that took more than it gave, left families weaker than they found them, converted generational wealth into personal comfort, ensured their legacy ended with themselves. No amount of denial will change this. No rewriting of history will erase it. The verdict is already forming, written in estranged families, empty inheritances, and generations forced to start from nothing. That is how baby boomers will be remembered, not as heroes, not as victims, but as the generation that broke the chain. In closing, the record is closed. This is where the story ends, not with reconciliation, not with understanding, and not with forgiveness. It ends with accounting. The baby boomer generation has spent decades insisting it deserves gratitude. Gratitude for surviving history, gratitude for raising children, gratitude for existing at the right moment in time. But gratitude is not automatic. It is earned through stewardship, responsibility, and what is left behind. What boomers left behind is absence. They raised children without emotional safety, then blamed them for being wounded. They pushed young adults into economic free fall, then mocked them for failing to land on their feet. They watched their own blood sleep in cars, skip meals, cycle through shelters, and carry lifelong trauma. While guarding assets they did not need and comfort they could easily spare. And when confronted, they did not reflect. They justified, they denied, they hardened, they called cruelty tough love. They called abandonment independence. They called greed prudence. They demanded understanding while offering none. This was not ignorance. The damage was explained to them, repeatedly, clearly, painfully, by their children, by data, by visible collapse. They chose not to care. They chose ideology over family. They chose comfort over continuity. They chose themselves, and now at the end they are completing the pattern. There will be no reckoning through inheritance, no restoration through transfer, no quiet admission of failure through provision. What remains of their wealth is being consumed, extracted, or redirected upward, into corporations, institutions, and elites who will never know their names. Their children will inherit bills, not houses. Their grandchildren will inherit instability, not security. Their legacy will not be prosperity, it will be fracture. This is what happens when a generation treats family as optional, responsibility as conditional, and morality as something owed to them but never required of them. Boomers often ask why they are estranged, why they are resented, why their children keep distance. The answer is simple and final: trust cannot survive abandonment, and abandonment repeated across decades becomes identity. History will not be sentimental about this generation. It will not adopt their self-image. It will not care how offended they are by criticism. History measures generations by outcomes, not intentions, and the outcomes are already locked in. They inherited abundance. They consumed it. They passed nothing forward. That is not a misunderstanding. That is not a tragedy. That is a choice, made over and over again. This report does not ask for apology. It does not seek reform. It exists because the damage is done and the pattern is complete. The record is closed. And no matter how loudly they protest, this is how the baby boomer generation will be remembered. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If this resonated with you, please like the video. If you have something to add or your own experience to share, leave a comment. And if these are conversations you want to keep having, subscribe to the channel. This is the things that bother me. Thanks for being here.